Late one night, under the dim glow of streetlights, Jalen Carter, a 12-year-old boy, gripped the steering wheel of a rusted old sedan, his small hands trembling as he fought to keep the car steady on the road. The weight of the newborn baby in his arms pressed against his chest, its tiny body radiating warmth, but also fragility. The infant's cries echoed through the empty streets, each wail growing louder, more desperate, more urgent. Jalen's heart pounded as he glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Every second felt like an eternity. And the baby's condition was worsening. His mind raced, his breath shallow, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. He knew he shouldn't be driving. But what other choice did he have? He had seen his neighbor collapse, her body crumpling to the floor as she gasped for air, her eyes pleading for help before slipping into unconsciousness. The baby, her baby, had been in the crib, screaming, helpless. No one else was home. No one else was around. He had called 911, but the operator had told him to wait for paramedics. Wait while this baby's cries grew weaker? Wait while time slipped away? He couldn't wait, so he grabbed the baby, wrapped her in a blanket, and got behind the wheel, pressing his foot against the gas pedal with all the determination in his small body. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even sure if he was doing the right thing. All he knew was that this baby's life depended on him. The car jolted as he sped over a pothole, the tires skidding slightly before he regained control. His mother's voice echoed in his head. Jalen, never do anything reckless. Be smart. Be safe. He wished she was here now. She worked long shifts at the diner, always doing her best to keep their little apartment running, always reminding him to stay out of trouble. This wasn't trouble, though. This was survival. He could see the hospital sign glowing faintly in the distance, a beacon of hope, but just as relief flickered in his chest, his stomach dropped. Flashing red and blue lights suddenly filled his rearview mirror. A siren pierced the night air. Jalen's pulse skyrocketed. No, 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 not now. He couldn't stop. He had to keep going. But the siren wailed louder, the flashing lights blinding in his mirror. His fingers tightened around the wheel, his breaths coming in sharp gasps. He wasn't doing anything wrong. So why did he feel like he was about to be arrested? The hospital was right there, but the police car was already on his tail. His body trembled as he slowly pulled to the side of the road, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The baby in his arms let out a feeble whimper, her tiny fists clenching as if she could feel his fear. Jalen whispered softly, trying to comfort her, but deep down, he was terrified for himself, for her, for what might happen next. The officer stepped out of his patrol car, his silhouette looming in the glow of the streetlights. Officer Mullins, a tall, stocky man in his 40s, with years of authority etched into the lines of his face. His boots crunched against the pavement as he approached the car, his expression hard, his eyes narrowing the second they landed on Jalen. The boy froze, gripping the baby tighter. He knew that look. He had seen it before. In stores, on sidewalks, at school. That look that said, "You don't belong here." Officer Mullins stopped by the driver's side, shining his flashlight through the window. His voice was sharp, accusing. "What do we have here? A kid behind the wheel? A stolen car, maybe?" His cold gaze flickered to the baby, then back to Jalen. His suspicion deepened. "What are you doing with that baby?" Jalen swallowed hard, his throat dry, his mind spinning. Please, sir," he stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. "She's sick. I'm taking her to the hospital. My neighbor, she collapsed." Officer Mullins didn't soften. His hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching as if he expected trouble. "You expect me to believe that?" His tone was filled with doubt, with something even darker beneath it. "Where's your mother? Huh? You think I don't know what's going on here?" Jalen's stomach churned. This wasn't happening. The baby needed help. He couldn't waste time proving his innocence to a man who had already decided he was guilty. His arms trembled as he held the baby close, her soft whimpers breaking his heart. "Please, sir," he said again, his voice almost a whisper. "She needs a doctor." For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in the officer's eyes. Hesitation? Uncertainty? But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the cold, hard wall of prejudice. "Step out of the car." Jalen didn't move. Fear gripped him like a vice. But so did determination. He had made it this far. He couldn't fail now. The baby needed him. If he got out, would the officer handcuff him? Would he separate him from the baby? Would the hospital be too far away by the time someone finally believed him? His breath hitched. He couldn't let that happen. Then, in the tense silence, the baby let out a piercing cry, her tiny body arching in distress. Officer Mullins flinched, his expression momentarily faltering. Jalen saw his chance. "Look at her," Jalen said, his voice stronger now. "She's sick. You can arrest me later if you want. But I have to get her help now." A war raged in the officer's eyes. Authority versus humanity. Bias versus truth. Seconds stretched into eternity. And then, finally, he stepped back. "Go." Jalen didn't wait. He slammed his foot on the gas, his heart racing faster than the car as he sped toward the hospital. The neon glow growing brighter with every second. He didn't look back. He didn't care what the officer did next. He just knew he had won. The baby was safe. And you? Have you ever been in a situation where you were judged unfairly? Have you ever had to fight for what's right, even when the odds were stacked against you? If this story made you feel something, if it made you angry, hopeful, or determined, then take a moment to support this channel. Like, comment, and subscribe, because these stories matter. Because voices like Jalen's deserve to be heard. Because truth will always be stronger than prejudice. And together, we can make sure that stories like this don't just stay stories, they become the reason for change. The flashing red and blue lights cast an eerie glow against the pavement, illuminating the inside of the car like a crime scene. Jalen Carter's hands gripped the steering wheel, his entire body frozen in place. The baby in his arms let out a weak, trembling cry, a sound so fragile, so desperate, that it nearly broke him. He wanted to keep driving, to push through the fear and get to the hospital. But he knew he couldn't outrun a police car. His mother's warnings about staying out of trouble rang in his head. But this wasn't trouble. This was survival. Yet, as Officer Mullins' heavy footsteps echoed toward the car, Jalen felt something colder than the winter air seep into his bones: dread. The officer approached, hand resting near his holster, his posture rigid with authority. His gaze, sharp and filled with something darker than suspicion, swept over Jalen before settling on the baby in his arms. "What the hell is this?" Mullins demanded, his voice edged with hostility. "A kid behind the wheel, a stolen car, and a baby that doesn't belong to him?" His words cut through the night, thick with accusation. Jalen's stomach twisted. He could already see where this was going. He wasn't a boy rushing to save a life, to this officer. He was a thief, a criminal, a suspect. Jalen swallowed back his fear, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's sick. I'm trying to get her to the hospital." His chest rose and fell rapidly as he fought to steady his breathing. He didn't want to be afraid, but the way the officer's eyes hardened, the way his fingers twitched near his weapon, made it impossible not to be. Mullins let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Oh, really?" he sneered. "And I'm supposed to believe that? A 12-year-old, out here in the middle of the night, with a baby?" He scoffed. "Whose car is this? Where are your parents?" Jalen's heart pounded. He didn't have time for this. The baby's cries were growing weaker, her tiny body writhing in discomfort. Every second wasted was another second closer to disaster. He tightened his arms around her, desperate to shield her from the cold, from the suspicion, from the delay that could cost her life. "Please, officer, I don't have time to explain. I just need to get to the hospital." "Step out of the car." Jalen's breath hitched. He shook his head. "No, please, just let me step out of the car." Mullins' voice turned ice cold, his hand now fully resting on the gun at his hip. Jalen trembled, trapped between the fear of being arrested and the terror of not reaching the hospital in time. His mind screamed at him. If he got out, would Mullins yank him away from the baby? Would he drag him to the ground, cuff him, ignore his pleas? Jalen had seen the videos. He knew how this could end. Then, suddenly, the baby let out a shrill, piercing wail, louder than before, her tiny fists clenching and unclenching, her body racked with distress. The sound sliced through the tension like a blade. Mullins faltered, for the first time since approaching the car. His eyes flickered with something almost human: doubt, hesitation, the tiniest crack in his hardened exterior. Jalen seized the moment. This was his chance. "She's sick," Jalen said, his voice thick with emotion. You can arrest me later if you want. You can say whatever you want about me. But please, just let me take her to the hospital." Mullins hesitated. And for the first time that night, Jalen felt hope. The air between them felt like it had stopped moving, heavy with the weight of a decision that could change everything. Mullins' grip on his belt tightened, his chest rising and falling as he stared at Jalen, really stared at him. Like he was seeing him for the first time. This wasn't a car thief. This wasn't a criminal. This was just a kid. A terrified boy clutching a baby who was fading before his eyes. The seconds dragged, agonizing and endless. Then, Mullins took a single step back. "Go." Jalen's eyes widened, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What?" "I said go," Mullins barked, but his voice wasn't as harsh this time. He knew he had been wrong, knew he had let his prejudice cloud his judgment. And now, he had to fix it. Jalen didn't hesitate. He floored the gas pedal. The car lurching forward. The hospital loomed ahead, the neon red, emergency, sign blazing like a beacon of salvation. The baby's cries had softened, but Jalen could feel her warmth against his chest, too warm. Feverish, weak. Tires screeched as he swerved into the hospital's driveway. Before he could even put the car in park, nurses rushed out, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. A woman in blue scrubs yanked open the door. "She needs help," Jalen gasped, his voice cracking. The nurse took the baby from his arms. And at that moment, for the first time all night, Jalen felt his body collapse with exhaustion. The doctors worked quickly, disappearing behind the double doors. He stood there, frozen, unable to move, until a gentle voice spoke. "You did the right thing, sweetheart." Jalen blinked, looking up at the nurse. Did he? He had almost been arrested, almost been stopped, almost let fear win. He swallowed. "Is she going to be okay?" The nurse nodded. "Because of you." Relief crashed into him like a tidal wave. He had done it. He had saved her. And as he stood there, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, he knew that one truth remained. He had been right all along. But what about Officer Mullins? What about the countless other kids like him? Stopped for no reason, accused before they could even speak? That night, Mullins sat in his patrol car, staring at his hands, replaying the moment over and over in his head. He had nearly let his prejudice cost a baby her life. It wasn't something he could ignore. Not anymore. And you, what would you have done? Have you ever been judged unfairly? Held back by assumptions? Stopped before you could even prove yourself? If this story moved you, take a stand, like this video, comment below, subscribe to this channel, because stories like Jalen's deserve to be told. Because change starts with awareness. Because one voice, one moment, one act of courage, can change everything. Jalen Carter sat in the cold, hard plastic chair of the hospital waiting room, his small hands trembling in his lap. The adrenaline from the night's events had long worn off, leaving behind an overwhelming exhaustion that seeped into his bones. His clothes were damp from sweat, his fingers sore from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was the baby. His neighbor's baby, the one he had fought so hard to save. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the closed emergency room doors as if sheer willpower alone could pull the doctors back through them with good news. A nurse had told him to wait, that they would update him soon. But what if soon was too late? His mind was still racing, replaying everything that had happened that night. His neighbor collapsing, the baby's weak, heart-wrenching cries, the desperate drive to the hospital. And then, the police stop. Jalen clenched his fists. The fear, the humiliation, the helplessness, it all came rushing back. Officer Mullins' cold, suspicious eyes, the way his hand never strayed far from his gun, the way he didn't see a child trying to do the right thing. He only saw a black boy in a car that didn't belong to him. Jalen had tried to explain, but the officer had already made up his mind. It wasn't until the baby's cries had cut through the thick air of tension that Mullins had hesitated. Even now, Jalen couldn't stop thinking about it. What if the baby hadn't cried in that moment? What if Mullins had pulled him out of the car, thrown him to the ground, handcuffed him, or worse, would anyone have believed him? His mother always warned him about people like Mullins. Be respectful. Jalen, keep your hands visible. Don't talk back. Just get home safe. But how could he get home safe when just existing in the wrong place at the wrong time put him at risk? He had done everything right. He had done everything a good kid was supposed to do. And still, he had almost lost. A lump formed in his throat. But he swallowed it down. He didn't have time to break down. Not yet. A soft voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. Jalen? His head snapped up, and he saw a nurse standing in front of him. His heart nearly stopped. She's stable, she said with a warm smile. She's going to be okay. The air rushed from Jalen's lungs so fast that he nearly gasped. His body sagged in relief, his hands unclenching as all the tension drained from him at once. He had done it. She was safe. She's a fighter. The nurse continued. And you're incredibly brave. You saved her life. You know that? Jalen shook his head, the weight of everything still pressing on his chest. He hadn't felt brave. He had felt scared, terrified, alone. But none of that mattered anymore. Because she was going to live. As Jalen sat in the waiting room, absorbing the news, he expected relief to wash over him completely. But something still felt heavy inside him, a deep, unsettling weight that wouldn't lift. He glanced at the television in the corner, where a local news broadcast played on mute. The scrolling headline caught his eye. Officer under investigation for racial profiling after stopping 12-year-old boy rushing baby to hospital. Jalen's stomach twisted. His name wasn't mentioned, but he knew exactly what they were talking about. Officer Mullins, the man who had nearly cost the baby her life. In that moment, Jalen felt something strange, pity. Because he realized Mullins had been scared, too, but not for the same reasons Jalen had been. Mullins wasn't afraid of losing his life, of making a mistake that could destroy everything. No, Mullins was afraid of being wrong. And because of that fear, he had chosen power over compassion, authority over justice, assumptions over truth. And now, it was too late for him to undo what had been done. Jalen's fingers curled into his hoodie as he exhaled. He didn't know if Mullins would lose his job. He didn't know if anything would really change. But maybe, just maybe, this would force people to start paying attention. He felt a hand on his shoulder. His mother. He hadn't even heard her come in. She crouched in front of him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and pride. I saw the news, she said softly. Baby girl's okay? Jalen nodded. His mother cupped his face, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. I'm so proud of you. Something inside Jalen cracked at those words. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear them. But, she continued, her voice gentle but firm. I hate that you had to go through that. I hate that the world made you feel like you had to fight so hard just to do the right thing. Jalen swallowed the lump in his throat. Me too. She pulled him into a hug. And for the first time that night, he let himself feel everything. The fear, the exhaustion, the anger, the unfairness of it all. He let himself cry into his mother's shoulder. Because for all his strength, for all his courage, he was still just a kid. And yet, that night, he had done something most adults wouldn't have had the bravery to do. As the news spread, the city began to stir. Protesters gathered outside the police station. Mullins' past complaints, the ones that had been ignored, were suddenly being reviewed. The people of the community, especially the ones who had been stopped like Jalen before, spoke out. Change wasn't immediate. It never was. But Jalen's story had started something. And you, watching this right now, what will you do? Have you ever been in a situation where someone judged you without knowing your heart? Have you ever felt trapped by a world that refused to see the truth? If you believe that stories like Jalen's matter, if you believe that truth should be louder than fear, then like this video. Comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Because the more we share stories like this, the harder it becomes for the world to ignore them. And change? It starts with people like you. Jalen sat at the kitchen table, the soft glow of the television flickering across his face. But he wasn't watching. He was thinking, remembering, feeling. His mother had gone to bed hours ago. But sleep refused to find him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flashing police lights, the suspicion in Officer Mullins' eyes. The way his hand hovered near his gun like Jalen was a threat instead of a kid trying to save a life. He remembered how his heart had nearly exploded in his chest when the officer ordered him out of the car. How his fingers had tightened around the baby's tiny body. How his voice had shaken when he pleaded for her life. He had done everything right. But it hadn't mattered. The only thing that had saved him was the baby's cries cutting through the tension. And even then, it had been so close. His fingers curled into fists as a familiar anger burned in his chest. Why did it have to be that way? Why did he have to fight so hard just to do the right thing? It wasn't fair. It would never be fair. He hadn't just fought for the baby that night, he had fought for himself. He had fought against the assumptions, the judgments, the belief that a boy like him, in a car that wasn't his, in a situation that didn't make sense to an officer like Mullins, could never be telling the truth. Jalen exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands over his face. And now, Officer Mullins was gone, fired, his career, his power, his badge, gone, just like that. The weight of it settled over Jalen like a thick blanket. He should have felt relieved, vindicated, and yet, he didn't feel anything at all. The news had spread fast. The footage from the officer's dash cam, combined with complaints that had been ignored for years, had forced the department to take action. They couldn't pretend Mullins hadn't racially profiled him. They couldn't ignore what the world had seen. The press had picked it up. Activists had spoken out. The mayor had promised police reform, but Jalen had heard those words before. He wanted to believe it. He really did. But would anything really change? His mind flickered back to that moment, the moment Mullins finally hesitated. The moment his authority, his assumptions, his years of prejudice collided with the reality of a baby who needed help. That was the moment everything had shifted. But not because of the system. Because of Jalen. Because Jalen had refused to back down. Because he had stood his ground in the face of injustice. Because, even when the world refused to see his truth, he had made them see it anyway. And that was something worth holding on to. Jalen's fingers tapped lightly against the table as he watched the news coverage continue. The reporter's voice filled the quiet room. The city's police department has announced a new initiative focused on combating racial profiling after the firing of Officer Mullins. Activists continue to push for further accountability, calling this a step in the right direction. But far from enough. Jalen let out a slow breath. It wasn't enough. Not for him. Not for the kids who would come after him. Not for the ones who wouldn't have the baby's cries to save them. He turned off the TV and sat there, staring at his reflection in the darkened screen. This wasn't over. Mullins had been just one officer. One piece of a broken system. And even though Jalen had won this fight, how many others had lost? That was the part that stuck with him the most. The part that kept him up at night. This fight wasn't about one bad cop losing his job. This fight was about making sure the next time a kid like him needed help, they weren't seen as a suspect first. His mother's voice echoed in his head. The same words she always told him: be smart, be careful, and come home safe. Jalen had done all of that. And still, it hadn't been enough to protect him. That's why he couldn't let this moment pass. That's why he needed you. Yes, you. Watching this, reading this, listening to this story. Because the truth is, Jalen isn't the only one who has been judged unfairly. He isn't the only one who has had to fight to be believed. He isn't the only one who has faced a world that saw him as guilty before it even saw him as human. And if that's ever been you, if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever had to fight for your truth, if you've ever had to demand that the world listen to your voice instead of drowning it out with its own assumptions, then stand with Jalen now. Like this video, leave a comment, share this story, subscribe to this channel. Because the more we speak, the harder it becomes for the world to ignore us. Because change doesn't happen when we stay silent. Because Jalen's story isn't just about him, it's about all of us. And if we stand together, then maybe, just maybe, next time, the world will listen before it's too late. The world had finally caught up with Officer Mullins. But for Jalen Carter, the battle wasn't just about one corrupt officer losing his job. It was about something much bigger. It was about every kid who had been stopped for no reason. Every child who had been judged before they even had the chance to explain. Every black boy who had been labeled a threat before the world saw him as a human being. Mullins was fired. The press had swarmed the police station. Headlines blaring the story of the officer who nearly cost an infant her life because of his racial bias. Reporters camped outside, flashing cameras, demanding answers. The mayor spoke on live television, calling for reforms. The police chief issued a formal apology, vowing to make changes. People called it a victory. They said Jalen had won. But Jalen? He wasn't sure what winning was supposed to feel like. Because in the back of his mind, he knew This shouldn't have happened in the first place. Even now, sitting at home, staring at the TV screen as they replayed the footage of his traffic stop, he still felt that fear creeping up his spine, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest, the flashing lights, the officer's cold, accusing gaze, the way his hand had hovered near his holster, like he was deciding whether or not Jalen was worth sparing. Jalen had seen it before, not in his own life, but on the news, in stories that ended in tragedy, in funerals, in hashtags, the same stories his mother begged him to learn from, the same ones that made her whisper to him every time he left the house. Be smart, baby. Be careful. Make it home. The world would see this as justice, an officer held accountable, a system exposed. But for Jalen, justice would mean that it never happened at all. His mother sat beside him, her hand resting on his. She was proud. He could feel it in the way she squeezed his fingers, in the way she looked at him like he was stronger than he knew. But he could also see the fear in her eyes, the fear that would never go away. No matter how many officers were fired, no matter how many promises the city made, because when the news cycle moved on, when the cameras packed up, when the hashtags stopped trending, what would really change? Jalen had spent so much time wondering what would have happened if the baby hadn't cried. If Mullins had dragged him out of the car before he had a chance to explain. Would he be here now? Would they still be calling him a hero? Or would they be playing his name in a different kind of headline? That was the part that made his stomach twist. That was the part that wouldn't let him rest. Because if this had happened to someone else, if it happened again, would the world listen? His phone buzzed beside him, the screen lighting up with a flood of notifications. His story had spread farther than he ever imagined. Messages poured in, some filled with support, some with anger, some with fear, some from people who had been stopped just like him, some from mothers who had lost their sons in moments just like this. But without the happy ending, Jalen didn't know what to say to them. He didn't know how to respond. But then, he realized, this was bigger than him. This wasn't just about one bad officer losing his job. This was about all the kids who had been stopped before him. And all the kids who would be stopped after. It was about the truth that people didn't want to admit. The truth that the system wasn't built to protect kids like him. And if that was true, then he had a responsibility. To speak, to make them listen, to make sure his story didn't fade away like so many others had before. So now, it's up to you. Yes, you. If you're still here, if you're still listening, if this story made you feel something, don't stay silent. Leave a comment. Let Jalen know that his voice matters. Let him know that he's not alone. That the fight doesn't end here. Because this story isn't just about him. It's about every person who has ever been judged before they were understood. Every person who has ever had to prove they were innocent before they were believed. Every person who has ever fought to be seen, to be heard, to be treated as human. So if you stand with Jalen, if you believe that truth deserves to be louder than prejudice, then drop a comment below. Tell him you see him, that you hear him, that you're with him. Because silence is what lets injustice win. And today, we refuse to stay silent. The world had already decided who Jalen Carter was before he even had the chance to speak. A criminal, a suspect, a black boy in a car he shouldn't have been driving. That's what Officer Mullins had seen when he pulled him over. His hand twitching near his holster. His voice edged with a cold authority that left no room for doubt. He didn't see the panic in Jalen's eyes. He didn't hear the desperation in his voice. He didn't see the baby's tiny, fragile body shaking against Jalen's chest as her cries grew weaker. No, Mullins had only seen what he had already decided was true. That this boy was up to no good. It didn't matter that Jalen was just a kid. It didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter that a life was at stake. Because to Mullins, none of that was as important as his own assumptions. And that's what made it dangerous. Jalen still remembered the way his hands had shaken against the steering wheel. The cold sweat beating at his temples. The way his entire body felt like it had locked up under the weight of fear and injustice. He had tried to stay calm. Tried to explain. Tried to make Mullins understand. But how do you make someone see the truth when they refuse to look at it? His mother had taught him how to handle these moments. Be respectful. Keep your hands visible. Never argue. Always say, yes, sir, and no, sir, as if the right words could somehow protect him. As if his life depended not on his innocence, but on whether or not an officer believed he was innocent. And that night, He wasn't sure if Mullins ever would. The only thing that had saved him was the baby's cries. The sharp, desperate wail that had finally broken through the officer's wall of doubt. For a moment, a single, fleeting moment, Mullins hesitated. And in that hesitation, Jalen saw something shift. Maybe it was doubt. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe, for just 1 second, Mullins saw not a suspect, but a scared child trying to do the right thing. But even then, it wasn't enough. Not right away. It took too long for him to lower his hand from his weapon. To let Jalen go. Too long for a decision that should have never needed to be made. Because in those moments of hesitation, of indecision, lives are lost, and Jalen knew that if things had gone just a little differently, his could have been one of them. He had done everything right. He had saved a life. But it could have cost him his own. The weight of that truth settled deep inside him, in a place he knew it would never leave. And now, Mullins was gone, fired, his name forever tied to the public outrage. The protests, the calls for justice, the news stations replayed the footage, dissecting his mistakes, analyzing how his bias had nearly cost a child her life. His police record, once buried beneath red tape and silent complicity, had been dragged into the light. The complaints against him, the ones that had been ignored for years, were finally being heard. And for the first time, the world was listening. But what happens when the cameras stop rolling? When the headlines shift? When the people move on to the next story? The next outrage? The next fight? Will anything really change? Jalen had spent nights staring at the ceiling, asking himself that same question. Because this wasn't about one bad cop losing his job. It wasn't about apologies or press conferences or promises of reform that rarely ever came true. It was about something much bigger. It was about every kid who had been pulled over and questioned for no reason. Every black boy who had been seen as a threat before he was seen as a child. Every life that had been taken before the world decided it was worth saving. And that's why this story can't be forgotten. That's why you can't forget. Because if Jalen had been a little older, a little taller, a little less calm, would the world have been mourning his name instead? If this story made you feel something, if you understand why this can't just be another forgotten moment in history, then speak up. Comment below. Say his name. Say something. Let Jalen know that his story matters. That his courage meant something. That the world sees him, hears him, and refuses to let his fight be for nothing. Because silence is what allows injustice to win. And today, we refuse to stay silent. The world had seen what happened to Jalen Carter. They had watched the footage, heard the outrage, read the reports about Officer Mullins' firing, the protests, the promises of change. But what happens when the news cycle moves on? What happens when the world forgets? That was the thought that haunted Jalen the most, not what had happened, but what would happen next. Because for all the noise, for all the public outcry, he knew the truth. Mullins wasn't the first officer to profile an innocent kid. And he wouldn't be the last. Jalen sat outside his apartment, staring at the city lights in the distance, thinking about the weight of the moment, the weight of his story. The night had changed him, not just because he had survived it, but because he had faced something bigger than himself, and won. Not with violence, not with anger, with truth. And that's what he wanted people to remember. The world had expected him to break that night, to panic, to give up, to accept whatever fate Officer Mullins had decided for him. But he hadn't. He had stood his ground. He had spoken his truth, even when it felt like no one was listening. And in the end, the truth had been too powerful to ignore. That was the lesson. That was the takeaway. Because one day, you might be in a moment where you feel powerless, where you feel like the world has already decided who you are before you even get the chance to prove them wrong. Where someone with more authority, more control, more power is telling you that your truth doesn't matter. And when that day comes, remember Jalen. Remember that truth is always stronger than prejudice. Remember that you don't have to scream to be heard. Remember that even when the world tries to silence you, your voice still has power. Because Jalen wasn't supposed to win that night. He wasn't supposed to make it to the hospital. He wasn't supposed to walk away with his dignity intact. But he did. And that is why his story matters. But this isn't just about Jalen. This is about all of us. It's about every person who has ever been judged unfairly. Every person who has ever had to fight for their truth. Every person who has ever felt trapped by a world that refuses to see them for who they truly are. So now, it's up to you. Yes, you. reading this, watching this, feeling something in your chest right now. If Jalen's story meant something to you, let him know. Drop a comment below. Tell him you see him. Tell him you hear him. Tell him that his story isn't just another moment in time, but a reminder of what is possible when we refuse to back down. And if you believe in stories like this, stories that expose truth, that challenge injustice, that remind us that we are stronger than the forces trying to silence us, then don't just watch. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel. Share this story. Because the more people see stories like this, the harder it becomes for the world to ignore them. And together, we can make sure that the next Jalen never has to fight this battle alone.